So now we're on Daf Samach Gimel and Beis. What is the list of problems that could arise when that dinar is paid to the storekeeper? Three problems. Number one, lo mishum shvius, lo mishum maser, velo mishum yayin nesach. There are three possible prohibited foods that are being sold by the storekeeper and purchased by the workers. One is yayin nesach. I'm starting from the bottom. That's simple. The storekeeper is selling yayin nesach, and that's osur bano. You certainly can't buy yayin nesach. Meiser means that the storekeeper was not careful about being mafresh maser, and therefore it's tevel. And if these workers will buy this tevel and eat the tevel, that violate a very severe isur. And shvius. Shvius is prohibited in schora, li'achla velo lemischar. So you can't buy peiros of shvius. So now, there are two possible ways that this arrangement could be implemented. One possibility is where the employer, the balabayas, will say, you know what? You take the produce from the storekeeper and I'll pay the storekeeper. That's going to be a major problem and a real headache for the employer, because in doing so, he's being machil his workers, macholos asuros. And not only that, he's abetting the storekeeper in the crime of selling. And that's called lifnei velosite michshel. So instead, what does the employer do? He gives over the dinar into the hands of the workers, and he says that you go spend the money wherever you want. Not my problem. V'im omer lahem tzu'u v'chlu v'ani poreh tzu'u v'shsu ani poreh choshish v'shvias mishum masa mishum yaines. However, if he says that I'm going to pay the storekeeper directly, I'm not going to give you the dinar as payment and you go ahead and buy it from the storekeeper. I'm going to pay the storekeeper. That's a problem. It's a problem of shvius, it's a problem of masros, and it's a problem of yayin nesach. Alma, says the Gemara, and this is now getting to the kasha that Rav Sheshes is raising against Rav Yanai and his household, and Rabbi Yochanan, who approved of that setup. Ki kapara, demei iser kapara. So let's focus for a moment on shvius. Right, we said in Rav Yanai and Rabbi Yochanan that they set up an arrangement in which on the 8th year they paid up the loan of the produce of the 7th year. But what's going on over here? The produce of the 8th year is in exchange for the produce of the 7th year, and then it takes on the status of shvius, and it's after Shas Biur. You're not allowed to do such a thing. The answer was because by the time the 8th year comes around, the produce was already consumed. And therefore, it's not going to be chalipa, it's not going to be an exchange for the shvius, and it doesn't take upon itself kedusha shvius with all these isurim involved. But here, we have a stira, we have a contradiction, because in a case where the employer, right, the balabayas, pays up the storekeeper, he violates all these isurim, even though, let's take the case of shvius, the shvius has already been consumed. The dinar, therefore, that's being paid is on shvius that's been consumed, and yet it's considered as if it's an exchange for the Shemitah produce, and therefore the domim take on the status of shvius. And now, when the balabayas pays the storekeeper with his shvius money, he's violating the iser of a peros shvius. And according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, that's not true at all. The deeder does not have the status of shvius with the kedusha shvius and the iser schora, because by that time the shvius the produce itself has been consumed. It no longer exists. We see in this price against Rav Yochanan that the damim are considered to mei isura, and therefore, if the damim are considered to mei isura and they take on the kedusha shvius despite the fact that the shvius itself was consumed, we have to apply the same principle to the 8th year produce, the shminis, in the scenario of Rav Yanai, and say that the 8th year produce, which is being paid for the 7th year produce, has the status of shvius despite the fact that by the time we get to the 8th year, the shvius has been consumed. As I said to you, I warned you, the sugya gets more and more complicated with every single line. First of all, let's translate the word makif, which is a verb from the noun hakofa. Hakofa means to pay on credit. Now, you only pay on credit if there's a kind of relationship between the malva and the lova, or that's not a good example, between the moker and the lokea. So like, I remember when I was a youngster, I was 16 years old, I spent the summer with my brother in Netanya. My brother had made Aliyah way before me. And I used to go to the makolet in the morning, and my brother said, pick up, yogurt or whatever they had over there. It was called Shikun Vatikim in Netanya. Anyway, I was woken up early in the morning by the chamor, by the donkey. I mean, that's what it looked like. I'm talking, 60 years ago. Anyway, almost. So you used to go in, and the chenvani would take out a little pinkas, and he'd write down how many eggs you took, how many yogurts you took, and you bought on credit. So that's called hakofa. Now, once there's hakofa, that generates what's called a shibud. So, for example, if I bought eggs and yogurt at the price of 10 shekel, then the seller, the storekeeper, has a shibud on my property, or in this case, my brother's property, of 10 shekel. And a shibud is considered partial ownership, as if he owns my property. The kevan di arvech lakuf arche lakufe konile dinar gabe. So we said that the storekeeper who's holding on to Shvius, Meiser, and Yayin Nesach, he is selling that produce but he's only going to be paid up later on. And that was the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. By the time he's paid up, the shvius, etc., was already consumed. No, the answer is that he acquires that money even before it's paid up. Doesn't that sound crazy? How could he acquire the dinar at the time of the sale, which makes it into a dinar of shvius? That's not possible. He hasn't been paid yet. How does he own the dinar? The answer is it's a hakofa situation in which he gains a shibud on that dinar as if he acquires that dinar at the moment of the sale. And therefore, that dinar is an exchange for the produce that he's selling, which is shvius, meiser, or yayin nesach. So that's the brisa. As far as Rabbi Yoda is concerned, there was no hakafa situation. So that when the aniyim supply Rav Yadai and his household with Shemitah produce, there's no relationship, there's no shibud, there's no akafa, and therefore, the Bei Rav Yadai did not receive payment at the time that they got the shvius. And if the shvius was consumed later on, when the aniyim received their payment, then it doesn't have kedusha shvius. So now the Gemara is medayik. Avol chen vani she'ena makifo mai mutter. Right now we have to go back to the Brisa, and the Brisa is talking according to Rav Chisda about a case of makifo, and therefore it's also the implication is if it hadn't been makifo, it would be like the situation of Yanai, and it would be mutter yichachi either tani tseu ve'ichlu b'dinar zeh tseu shu b'dinar zeh liflog v'lisnei b'didah b'med dvar ma'amur b'chen v'ari makifo demishtabed le avol chen v'ani she'ena mashkifo mutter. Why did the Brisa? This is a kash on Rav Chisda. Why the Bryce have to stretch his arm out to a case where he said Tz'u ve'ichlu b'dinar zeh liflog v'lisnei? He could have just said that this whole problem only exists because it's a specific case of makifo. If it not, and that generates the shibud. And if it's not makifo, then it's mutter. V'yod, and furthermore, chen vani she'ein makifo milo mishtabed. You're assuming that if there was no hekev, then there's no shibud, and therefore the money was not acquired at the moment of the sale. Well, ha'amar Rava, ha'omer lechavero. Rava said if a person says to his friend, Tnu mana leploni, I ask you to pay money out to so and so. V'yiknu kol nechasai lecha. Kana midin orit. So apparently there's a separate new kinyan called the kinyan Oriv. Right? Oriv is a guarantor. So let me just jump ahead of myself a little bit. Let's go back to the case of the storekeeper, and there's no hakafa. He doesn't extend credit to the employer. But nevertheless, the storekeeper supplied the workers with food, and he was doing so on behalf of the employer. The employer therefore becomes an Oriv. In other words, payment for the food that's being given by the storekeeper to the workers is backed up and guaranteed by the Balabayas. And therefore, if the Balabayas guarantees the payment, then the storekeeper already gets a kinyan in the domim of the Oriv, in the properties or possessions of the Oriv, which in this case is the Balabayas. So what is this brand new kinyan, new category called Oriv? Kodamidin Oriv. 1 second. So let me just give a scenario. Let's say Ruvain borrows $1,000 from Shimon. Ruvain's the lover, Shimon is the malva. Levi comes along and he says to Shimon, I will back up this chov. Immediately, Shimon gains a shibud in the property of Levi, of the Arev. And so too, in the case of the storekeeper, when the Balabayas who hired the workers guarantees payment for the food that the storekeeper supplies to the workers, he, the Balabayas, the employer, becomes an Arev. He's backing it up. And at that point, the storekeeper gets a shibud on the property of the Arev, namely on the property of the employer. So therefore, the Gemara rejects Rav Chisda. As I said before, Rav Chisda is not going to last too long, and El Amar Rav. So now, again, let's just get our bearing here. Ela Amar Rava is going to suggest another reconciliation of Rav Yanai and Rav Yochanan with the Bryce. Lo shno makifa, lo shno she'e makifa. We're not going to make any distinctions whether it was bought on credit or not on credit. Afal gav de mishamidlo. So even though there's a shibud, which means that Rav Yanai is meshubad to the aniyim, because he's going to pay with peiros shminis in lieu of the peiros shvius that he took from the aniyim. Keven de lo miyachte shibud lo mitzah. So what does this mean, lo miyachta shibude? This is similar to what we discussed in the case of Esnan Zona when we differentiated between tlezeh or tlestam. Here too, when the rich people, we'll call them, the magnanimous people, wanted to give a gift of shminis to the aniyim by taking the shvius, they didn't specify where the aniyim would collect the shminis from. They didn't say, oh, collect it from here. So this kind of a shibud is a weaker kind of a shibud. It's sort of watered down. Elahacha, but here in the Brisa, that's already different. Now, why should the Brisa be different? The same way that Rava says that there's no problem if he wasn't miyachid something for the shibud. Here also, in the case of Brisa, he wasn't. Dinar. So the employer gave a dinar to the storekeeper, and this is way before the workers even came into the store to get their payment and their food from the storekeeper. Once he pays for Shemitah produce up front, that becomes an exchange for the produce. In Rav Yanai's case, on the other hand, nothing was paid in advance. The Shminis would be given when we get to the 8th year. Omer of Kahana, Amrisa l'shmaita kami de Rav Zvid midardo. When I told this over to Rav Zvid, Omer li, he responds, Hachi. If this be the case, once again we have what's called a kind of diuk in the Brisa. Adatoni tzu v'ichlu tzu shu vani porea. Tzu v'ichlu tzu shu ani machashev mi boile. The Brisa's language is not precise. It should have said machashev. What does machashev mean? In other words, you have a definite shibud, and we'll just calculate to see how much of my property is worth a dinar. Omer Slay, so he responds to Rav Zvid's argument. He says, Tnu, I'm going to change the reading of the Brisa to Uvani Machashe. Okay, now we get to Rav Ashi. You think we're out in the clear, but we're not. And we only have a minute or two left. We'll see what we can accomplish. I just want to accomplish Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi Omar, Kigon shenotal v'nosem biyad. So it wasn't a case where the workers came in and the employer gave them the dinar and said to them, you go in to the store and buy what you want for the dinar. No. It was the employer himself, the balabayis, who went into the store, took the dinar, bought the food, and then gave the food over to the workers. And he says, Nosan biyad, meaning he literally picked up the food in his hand from the storekeeper and delivered it over to the workers. So it comes out, according to Rav Ashi, that we're dealing with a whole different Isur here. The problem here is not Shemitah, per se. In other words, that the money is exchanged for Shemitah and so forth and so on. But the problem is Lifnei Iver. In other words, if the storekeeper is selling Shvius, Meiser, Tevel, meaning, or Yayin Nesach, and now the Balabayis, the employer, is giving that over to the workers, he's being machshel the workers. The workers are now getting Shvius, Maser, or Yayin Nesach. That has nothing to do with the case of Rav Yana and Rav Yochanan. There was no feeding something that's also. If that's the case, Adatoni to uvi ichlu to shisu to the ichlu tlu ushsubi boile. The language of the Bryce is not precise. Instead of saying go and eat, it should have said take this and eat it. Go and eat it means go in, take the dinar, and buy the food. It should have said, here's the food, I already paid for it, take it and eat it. Amalei, Rav Ashi says, we'll change the language of the Brisa. Tni, you should say in the Brisa, tlu v'ichlu, tlu ushasu. And this leads us to Yosef, Rav Nachman, and in Mitzvah Hashem, we'll pick that up tomorrow at noon. Is that good? Have to bench go mill.